And so the question that brings me here today is to ask, how can we better understand forced displacement? How can we better understand the factors that would drive people like this family here in Iraq to migrate forcibly either internally or across an international border and become refugees? And the problem that I see with the current state of understanding, despite the many studies and expert research that I draw on, and my co-author and I draw on in this book project that was just mentioned, is that knowledge tends to be extremely siloed about these issues. And it's siloed in several different ways. One way is the organization of the academy. Since the 1980s, there's been a whole separate field of refugee studies, which has become forced migration studies in most iterations. So it has its own journals, it has its own institutes, it has its own experts. And it's been surprisingly separate, especially in the US, but not exclusively so, from the study of international migration, and specifically the sociology of international migration. So there's always been some overlap, but even people working on refugees have not necessarily considered themselves to be refugee scholars. Often there is the argument made that, well, refugees are not international migrants. The UNHCR is quite adamant about this. Many advocates are adamant about saying refugees are not migrants, they're completely different. We can talk about why that is. It's for some understandable reasons, because there is a statutory definition of refugee that 148 countries have agreed upon. It gives people rights that are different and better than international migrants, other international migrants, to the extent that refugees cannot be lawfully refouled and sent back into the arms of their persecutors. But the academy continues to be siloed, and I think that's to the detriment of understanding the experience of refugees, because refugees and other international migrants, maybe they're separate in some ways, but they also have a lot of similarities and what's driving their movement and what's driving different kinds of integration patterns as well. A second way that the field is siloed comes to the different international agencies and UN agencies that deal with questions that are related. So we have the UNHCR, of course, which is the UN Refugee Agency. But already we've been reminded by the Israeli invasion of Gaza that not all refugees are under the mandate of the UNHCR, and that Palestinians fall under the mandate of UNRWA. We have, there are many other ways that even within agencies, knowledge is siloed, right? So within the UNHCR, you have people worried about legal protection, you have other people worried about more operations of relief, and often the left is not exactly aware of what the right is doing, and they have some slightly different interests when they're producing knowledge about refugees. Within the legal studies and within the law generally, you have different bodies of law that are applicable to the situation. So international humanitarian law, i.e. the law of war, is a separate field of endeavor from international refugee law, and there are big disputes within even the study of international refugee law as to whether or not that's a subcomponent of immigration law or something that's completely different. So in many different ways you see this siloing of knowledge, and so what we try to do in this book is say, look, we understand that knowledge can sometimes be siloed for good reasons, that it has to be siloed. If you're doing an academic study, we were just having a conversation today about some research projects here, you have to impose certain boundaries or it's impossible. Social reality is endless. So you have to impose boundaries. If you're doing refugee status determination, if you are in an asylum hearing, you have to have a legal definition of who a refugee is and stick to that and some kind of common understanding and put boundaries. So understand that. The problem is that a lot of the knowledge that we have about refugees is derived from actors that have particular operational goals and particular political goals. But then the way that knowledge is gathered can be uncritically adopted by researchers who are not deciding who is a refugee and has legal rights, and who are not deciding how many tents we need for a refugee camp or something like that. So there's a mismatch between the way that knowledge is produced and then academic needs to understand things with a bit more critical distance. So I'm going to go over each one of 6 effects of these silos, and then talk about some ways that a systems approach can manage that, if not fully remedy it. Okay, so the first is that we can understand why an agency or lawyers might, defend to the death a definition of refugees based on the 1951 Convention. But if we take a step back from that, if we think more sociologically, we see that there are many people who share almost all similarities, except some of them crossed an international border and others did not. So you can look at a particular family, for example, and you can see that maybe there are 10 people in the family, 5 of them were able to cross the border, say from Syria to Jordan, the other 5 are stuck in Syria, the border closes. The reasons why they fled, because their hometown was being bombed or they were being chased by the government, their aspirations to live in safety and security, all of those are the same. The only difference is that some were unlucky enough or didn't have the resources to be able to cross the border. So we don't want to exclusively use this legal definition of refugees when we're thinking about displacement more sociologically. And again, I'm not hostile to having a legal definition, but as an analyst, I want to be able to have a bit of critical distance. So the second, and this was really quite surprising actually when I started researching these things. I've spent my whole life researching international migration and the last decade on forced migration. But in a lot of the knowledge, especially that's produced for public consumption by practitioners, but also is used by academics, there's a real neglect of why people are moving in the first place. So for example, the most influential text in this field is the annual trends report that comes out from the UNHCR every year. Absolutely everybody in the field uses it. I use it. It's an incredible work that brings together all this information every year and puts it out on a much faster time scale than at least I as an academic can fathom. And yet you can peruse that for a long time and not really understand why there are, more or less 120 million displaced people. There are gestures to, root causes, people are fleeing conflict, people fleeing civil war, but it's at a very, very thin level. You wouldn't know what's the logic of that conflict. It's not that people always flee when there's a conflict. You wouldn't know much about the perpetrators, for example, and what different people are trying to accomplish when they leave or when they're forcibly pushed out. So, we want to start thinking very seriously about the causes, which means taking the analysis not at the point that a refugee crosses the border and becomes a refugee, but what's happening in the first place. And again, the answers are not obvious. It's not obvious that just because there's a war, people leave. There are wars all the time, and most people don't leave. And within the same family, some people leave and others don't. So how can we understand this extreme heterogeneity? Another problem, if you just take a standard definition of refugee, or even if you include your field of analysis to think about IDPs, internally displaced persons, you're ignoring the people who can't move. And what reminded, again, in the Gaza situation of this, of people who cannot move, they cannot leave, right? The hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who cannot leave the Gaza Strip, maybe they can't even leave their neighborhood. There are other reasons why someone can't leave. Maybe they are interned. Maybe they're jailed by the regime. Maybe they're living underground, resisting persecution, afraid to pop up. There are many different reasons why people facing persecution or living in a state of violence don't move at all. And we don't, the problem with the frame of things that are on the move as being our starting point of analysis is that we forget that there are people in very similar situations who stay put. And I'm not trying to give you a hard time because I know the name of your unit is on the move. But this is an issue at all levels of international organizations too. How do we describe people who've been displaced and still think about people who are subject to similar situations but don't move? We don't actually have a really good vocabulary to be able to deal with this issue. We know for a long time that the humanitarian organizations focus on 3 so-called durable solutions to displacement. And they actually have the same durable solutions for internally displaced persons as refugees who cross the border, with the exception that refugees have crossed that border. But the 3 solutions are resettlement, local integration, or return. And that's fine. I have nothing against those 3 categories. For a lot of people who have been forced to flee, that is a durable solution. But that framework of the durable solution has been criticized by some scholars for being kind of the view of a state or the view of a refugee administrator. that the refugee is no longer a problem for the international system because the refugee has now been shoved back into a nation-state container. And we know from a lot of people's work, and Katie Long in particular, a researcher from the UK who's now in San Francisco, she really makes this point forcefully in her work, which is to show that for many refugees, some kind of continued movement or continued forms of exchange across international borders is an important part of their lives. Just because they've been displaced once doesn't mean that they don't have an interest in, for example, moving among a set of countries, or maybe they have family or commercial ties or work ties that supersede a nation-state boundary. So to invoke Andreas Wemmer here, who very famously wrote about methodological nationalism, we don't want to invoke this, or we don't want to invoke it. We don't want to assume a methodological nationalist viewpoint, which is that people should be in a single nation-state container, and that anything that involves movement is somehow an aberration. That's a nation-state way of thinking that's not a sociological reality. Okay, and another issue that we find as a problem with the siloed approach is in the academy, and looking at our own work, looking at my own previous work, so I'm guilty of all of these things too. And that is to typically focus on one stage of displacement in isolation. So there are plenty of researchers who look at conflict situations and try to understand why do some people leave and others don't. Others look at, we just mentioned this book that I wrote, Refugee on Reach, at the issue of remote control, how the governments of rich countries like the US or EU countries try to keep asylum seekers far away. Or we look at studies of refugee integration. Right now I'm co-chairing a study of refugee integration in the States. Lots of work in Europe. We were just talking about over lunch on the issue of resettled refugees in country X. And then there's a lot of other work on refugees in camps or refugees in informal settlements. But these are very rarely put together to see what we can learn by thinking about the interactions between them. And then finally, another issue of these siloed approaches derives from the way that refugee studies came into being. It came into being as a field in the 1980s, very much influenced by immediate policy concerns. And that's understandable, that's great. It's important that we have a lot of people working on finding the solutions for people who've been displaced. I'm very much in favor of that. But analytically, one of the problems with this approach is that it tends to generate this sense that the problems of the present are so much worse than they've ever been before, what some philosophers have called methodological presentism, kind of the cognate to methodological nationalism. But the idea here, again, is that people, without articulating it necessarily, although sometimes they actually articulate it, they think that the problems now are so much worse and different than the way they've been before. So we hear this, for example, with the claim, which is not true, that the world is facing the highest levels of displacement in its history. But in fact, both the absolute and the relative levels of displacement were much, much higher after World War II than they are today. Another place we see this is in the recurring claim that refugees today are so different from the way they were when the refugee regime was created, particularly in its modern version in 1951. And the claim is that, well, today we have mixed flows, meaning you have flows of both refugees and economic migrants moving side by side in the same space. And another meaning of mixed flows is that you have the same individual who has mixed motivations. The same individual might be fleeing from persecution at the same time as they have economic motivations, push and pull factors. And the current situation is often juxtaposed against the good old days of the dissidents from the Soviet bloc who were fleeing across the Berlin Wall to the west. A very common claim. And then the policy recommendation that comes out of that is to say, well, we need a new refugee regime because the current one is not adequate for the current context, so it needs to be changed. That's a common argument. Well, everything starts to fall apart when you interrogate it with a little more historical rigor, I should say. For one thing, if you go back and you look at studies of people leaving communist countries coming to the West, whether it's from East Germany to West Germany, or from Hungary after the revolution to Austria, you look at the reports of the humanitarian agencies, the CIA, the CIA documents that have been released, a couple of academic studies, and they all found that most people who came across were not dissidents. Some of them were, but most of them were not dissidents. In the Hungarian example, most people were living in the west of Hungary. They weren't involved in the revolution in Budapest. So the gates opened, they had an opportunity, so they left. They left because they lived in the right part of the country. Most people who left Cuba early on to go to the States might have been refugees by some kind of sociological definition of refugee, but by a few years later, they probably weren't. You could say the same thing about people who left Indochina to go to Australia and Canada and the US and so forth. So that's an unpopular position in many circles, but it's my point is, we could talk about the details, my big point is the idea of mixed migration is not new. There's always been mixed migration. And this has always been part of the policy debate. If you look at policy debates in the British Parliament about what to do about French royalists arriving in England after the French Revolution, there was a big debate about how to distinguish between the ones who were really coming to seek liberty and those who were coming to cause problems, who would be a security threat, and how to root out the terrorists among them. So these ideas are not new, and so I think it's really important to avoid this methodological presentism and take this more historical approach. Okay, so what do we offer that we think is a useful way of thinking about this instead is a systems approach. Now, there are many different features of a systems approach that we developed in the book. One of them is, if you were to boil it down, it's this idea that in some kind of social process, you have outputs at a given moment, and then those are reincorporated as new inputs through various kinds of feedback mechanisms. So there's an emphasis on feedback, there's an emphasis on interactivity, there's an emphasis on the way that things that happened in the past deeply affect what's happening now in some surprising ways. So for example, I'm not sure how many people here are sociologists, but are you familiar with the notion of path dependency? Is anybody not familiar with path dependency? If you're not familiar with path dependency, look at the laptops in front of you. So I assume the bottom of the keyboard is QWERTY, at least it is in English, the QWERTY keyboard. The QWERTY keyboard was designed to make typing slower because it was designed for mechanical typewriters, and if people type too fast, then the keys would all get mushed up. That's how I learned to type. And so the designers deliberately figured out, again, I'm going to use my English language reference, what are the letters that are not usually used together, and putting your fingers together, and they deliberately made it to slow down typing. Okay, so no one uses a manual typewriter anymore, and there are other keyboards, and anyone can change in their setting instantly to a different setting, and you can buy a little overlay that's a Dvorak keyboard, at least in English, and people will typically, within 2 or 3 weeks of training, they'll increase their typing speed by 30%. And almost nobody does that. Even I who know that and who type for a living, I don't do that. So the point is that I'm living in the situation of path dependency. I don't approach the world and think, what's the problem? Let me come up with the best solution. That my solutions are sharply constrained by the past. And we see this with the way that governments address refugee issues, and we see this with the way that refugee flows are very, very sharply influenced by other kinds of flows, such as labor migration flows. So anyway, I'll go give some more concrete examples of what I think we can get out of a systems approach. Now, we're not the ones who came up with the idea of the system when it comes to anything, including migration. This notion originally was developed by a Nigerian social geographer, Akin Mabugunje, to talk about regional within Nigeria, sort of systems of internal migration. It's been developed by other people to talk about systems of international migration. So, for example, the system of Mexico-U.S. migration, or South Asia to the Gulf migration. Many different migration systems around the world, and that includes Fawcett, Fitz, and Zlotnick, Massey. So, closer to what we're working with is the work of Aristide Zolberg, who wrote a book more than 30 years ago, Escape from Violence, that we're very much in dialogue with. And he didn't use the word systems theory, but he was doing a version of that without using that term. Oliver Bakewell, a scholar of development, has worked on refugee issues in Africa. He's done some more work on on systems approaches. So what we're trying to do is stand on the shoulders of all of these giants and elaborate a systems approach to forced migration, the way that has already been highly developed for international migration. And in doing so, we can draw on a lot of resources, intellectual resources, that come out of the study of international migration, such as the notion of world systems theory. Okay, so I won't go exhaustively through what we do in the book, but just to give you a little hint, and if you're interested, I have some little cards here. And there's a QR code, and you can get the intro for free if you're interested. So we talk about, what is a systems approach? And then this question of who is a refugee. This is a huge, huge issue. And it's a highly consequential issue, right? This is what happens in an asylum hearing, is people decided yes or no, are you going to be expelled or no? But it's also an issue in the academy. And we talk about, there's not one answer to this question. There will never be one answer to this question. But we talk about conceptually, what are the different ways that this is approached? So we have, people who insist, what really matters is self-identification. You feel like you're a refugee, yes or no? The issue there is that some people say they are refugees, but they're not legally recognized as such. You have other people who are legally recognized, but they don't like being called refugees. Hannah Arendt, in her famous essay, We Refugees, she starts out saying, in the first place, we don't like being called refugees. There's a certain stigma in many circles to being called a refugee. So you can think about, self-identification as one way. You can think about a realist sense that refugees are a real ontological thing. There is a different experience that generates someone we're going to call a refugee that's different from other kinds of migration. The law does this very explicitly. The UNHCR will say that when people are found to be refugees, they don't become refugees in that moment. They've always been refugees, and now they're just being understood as such. And then you have people like what I consider myself a sociological realist, who says, yes, it can be very difficult in practice to distinguish refugees from other migrants. There are all kinds of messy factors at the borders, but there's a there. That some people really have fled violence and persecution, and in some cases it's really, really clear, even if in other cases it's fuzzier. And on the other extreme, you have constructivists, and this is a very common position in anthropology and sociology, basically saying that the whole thing is made up, and it's all an exercise in political power. So we rehearse all those debates, then we talk about where the refugee regime came from, and it has some surprising roots that are poorly understood even among legal scholars of refugee law, I think. Many of the roots are in things like anti-slavery laws and what to do when ships carrying slaves were intercepted by the British Navy, for example. Political extradition law, should people be extradited if they've only committed political crimes? All of these issues predate international refugee conventions by sometimes hundreds of years. And then the multilateral agreements around asylum did not start in Europe. Almost all studies start with the League of Nations and exclusively European countries signing these instruments in the 1920s at first. But both diplomatic asylum, where people gain asylum by going to an embassy or some other kind of diplomatic premise, sometimes a ship or an aircraft, that kind of notion. Like think of Snowden, the WikiLeaks whistleblower in the Moscow airport. That's a kind of diplomatic asylum. So there's diplomatic asylum, and there's also territorial asylum, and both of those, as multilateral agreements, come out of South America in the 1880s. Not coming from Europe until the League of Nations arrangements in the 1920s. So in any event, we talk about the development of that, and many refugee laws actually that have completely fallen out of standard accounts. Then we talk about should I stay or should I go? And this is what I'll be talking about more in detail, but it's based on a longitudinal study of the Syrian family in dialogue with some more macro level literature about how people make decisions. We look seriously at exit. Why do people leave? And there are many different logics of combat that explain these things. Sometimes refugees are unintended victims of war. So the militaries did not intend to create refugee flows, but because they were bombing in a particular area, then the refugees flee. So that's one modality. But then you have examples of deliberate ethnic expulsion. You have examples of, say, a genocide, or mass killing, and then some people are fleeing from that. You have sometimes situations where governments are forcibly relocating large parts of the population within the country for a number of different reasons that we go through. And then so people sometimes try to escape from those situations by crossing an international border. So the point is that there are many different logics of exit. It is not simply that there's a war and people leave. And we need to understand those because that shapes their experiences when they leave, but it also shapes the possibilities of their return. We look at hosting in the mini global souths. Obviously, it's a facile division of the world, divided into the north and the south. Anytime you take more or less 200 countries and divide them in two, you're going to use some violence to reality. Nevertheless, when we think about global north versus global south, we're emphasizing relationships of power. And so we look at how countries within the global south, and there's a lot of variation, we unpack some of that variation in some case studies about what they are trying to accomplish in their refugee policies. And then we do the same thing for more powerful host countries like the US, France, Canada, etc. Then we look at diasporic ties, transnational ties, you can dispute these terms if you like, and also issues of return. Under what conditions do refugees engage in these cross-border connections? Under what conditions are they less likely to do that? And then what facilitates return? Okay, so one of the advantages, I think, of thinking about a whole refugee system, a global system, is that it throws into relief the way that the global north and the global south together create a single system. And this is a proportional representation map which was made before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, so it's a little bit frozen in time. But even with the large number of Ukrainian refugees who fled mostly to Western Europe, it still remains the case that more than 8 out of 10 refugees in the world are in the global south. But they're in the global south not necessarily because that's where the conflicts are. I mean, that's part of the reason. That's not the only reason. But also a whole series of mechanisms that keep people in place. And the global north states, the rich states, are very much part of that. And so that includes, some typical suspects like the US and Canada and the EU, but also places like Japan and South Korea, which accept very, very few refugees, really completely symbolic numbers of refugees on the magnitude of maybe 100 a year. In a place like Japan, almost no asylum seekers. But they pay a great deal of money to the UNHCR to fund their operations that keeps people in the global south. So in some ways, what a country like Japan does is an extreme example of what practically all countries in the global north do. Now, these kind of humanitarian interventions, refugee camps, even though only about 1 out of 10 refugees live in camps, most refugees are living in cities. But all of these interventions, whether they're in camps or later, living in cities, and maybe they have some kind of ATM card that they're able to use to access UNHCR benefits. These combine different logics. They combine the logic of care, of providing often life-saving relief, truly life-saving relief. Water, food, shelter from the elements, things like that. And over time, more ambitiously, access to education for the kids and things. But also control. And if you look at different accounts in the literature, they'll emphasize one or the other. So clearly, self-reports by the humanitarian agencies emphasize the care, and then you have, critical refugee studies with a capital C that only looks at control and sees the entire thing as being kind of a Foucauldian exercise of complete surveillance and discipline. Both of these things are true, and the same architecture, literally the same architecture, the same camp that's providing this life-saving care is also a mechanism of control, and I think it's a mistake to only think about one of those. They're both happening at the same time. Okay, so let's get into what are some of the concrete advantages of taking a systems approach as opposed to a siloed approach. Just by way of illustration. So again, what we're saying is not that siloed knowledge is useless. No, that's what we're drawing on. But we're saying that we can also learn something really special if we put these things together in a way that's not usually done. So let's think about resettlement. So resettlement is where refugees are chosen, usually in a country where they don't have nationality, and they go through a long process and in a very orderly way, organized by the IOM. Then they arrive, usually flying, to a country of resettlement. And historically, 3 countries have completely dominated resettlement international. So that's the US, Canada, and Australia. And there are small-scale resettlement programs, they wax and wane, but there's resettlement in about 30 countries. So you can find some resettled refugees in the UK and Germany and Sweden and so forth. But these days, it's far, far less than 1%. It's about 0.5% of even refugees under the UNHCR mandate, excluding Palestinians who are not eligible for resettlement. That's not what UNRWA does. So it's a very small percentage of the world's refugees that ever resettle. You know, there's so much attention. Like if you go to the US and you think about refugee studies, overwhelmingly it's going to be about this. Well, this past year, it was 100,000 people, so that's not nothing, and it could be really important for those 100,000 people, but it's a drop in the bucket if you think about the total global population of refugees. Okay, so very few people resettle, but there's no queue to get in. It's not as if a refugee arrives at the camp and says, oh, okay, I would like to be resettled to Canada, sign me up, and then waits until her name goes down the list. It's much more like a lottery. It's not a complete lottery. It's not a completely random process. There are different priority categories. So, you know, people who have special medical needs and are exceptionally liable to be persecuted and are in danger, women and girls. I mean, there's a priority list, so it's not a complete lottery. But from the perspective of the individual, it feels much more like a lottery than a queue, than a line to stand in. Okay, so what's important then about looking at the way the countries of transit and resettlement together affect the experiences of refugees who want to be resettled and won't, is that there's this disciplinary mechanism, and it is a Prof disciplinary mechanism. That this resettlement program that will affect very few refugees directly, in the sense of being resettled, it disciplines all of the people who are hoping to win the lottery. And if you're hoping to win the lottery and conditions are bad, if you feel like you're being abused by the local government, say, or you think that the UNHCR camp administrators are doing something wrong, or whatever your complaint is, however legitimate your complaint is, there are many, many, many case studies showing that the refugees are less likely to complain about that, to protest, because they don't want to be labeled as troublemakers and be taken off the list, whether overtly or not, but they don't want to be taken off the list of people who might be resettled. So this is a process that directly affects very few people and indirectly affects many, many, many people. And there are, in the book we cite the specific examples of that. Okay, another way that we can take advantage of putting these things together. And here I'm drawing from the work of my new colleague at the University of California, San Diego, Jake Watson, who's looking at refugee resettlement to the US. Refugee resettlement to the US is a major puzzle. It's a major puzzle because the US, since World War II, has resettled about 5 million people. And until 1980, all but fewer than 1,000 were from communist countries. Even after 1980, they were overwhelmingly from communist countries. With the end of the Cold War, you see the major sources of refugee resettlement kind of smoothing out over time. There are places like Myanmar, the Congo, Nepal, and it's very, very difficult to look at those cases and think this serves the interest of U.S. foreign policy. The way it was obvious that taking refugees from Cuba or North Korea or the Soviet Union served the interest of U.S. foreign policy, same in the other Western countries, by saying, look, communist countries are not serving their people well and they're voting with their feet by leaving. Right? So there's an obvious foreign policy logic to all of the Western countries and their refugee resettlement back in those days. So these days, it's hard to understand that. Why is that? Why do governments do what they do? If you ask them, they'll say, well, we're humanitarian. But that's usually not a very compelling explanation in political science. Well, it turns out that in the US, that the sources of refugees, it's very much a path dependency story. There's a pipeline that was formed, for example, after the conclusion of the US war in Indochina, to take refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia, for example, through camps in Thailand, among other places, and then resettle them in the US. There's a whole long story we could tell about the various compacts around this. Suffice it to say that the US government developed, in coordination with Thai authorities, this really developed mechanism, expertise, procedures, protocols for how to resettle refugees from Thailand to the US. Well, now when Vietnamese come to the US, they come through family reunification. They don't come as resettled refugees anymore. But the US has resettled, the number one group in the recent years has been people from Myanmar. Now, by any definition, they're refugees, but few people would be able to make a compelling argument that they're the refugees with the greatest need, or that the US government is somehow better serving its foreign policy interests by taking refugees from Myanmar than from many other countries where there are persecuted people in conflicts. And it turns out that my colleague has gone out and done all this archival work and interviewed all the people involved in the process. That's because the architecture is there, and so that's why people come from there. And bureaucrats who are in the process can very quickly clear their cases. They're successful bureaucrats. They can say, we opened 100 cases, and we closed 100 cases. Whereas if you were to start resettling refugees from, I don't know, some places in the world where there's ongoing conflict, and you open 100 cases, you close 20, you look like you're not doing your job. So it's very much a bureaucratic path dependency story that helps explain the particular places of origin. So you wouldn't know that if you just, took this this siloed view of resettlement that begins once people get off the plane in New York or LAX. Okay, so in general, studies of refugee resettlement are interested in what happens to refugees after they arrive. Are they integrating? Are they assimilating? I know assimilation is a bad word in many quarters, but are they, let's use the word integrating. Are they integrating? What's happening to them? How quickly are they learning the native language that's spoken by the majority? What's happening with their education and their occupations, their median wages, naturalization, things like this. So almost all of these studies begin their story when the refugees walk off the aircraft in Toronto or Sydney or Los Angeles. But all over the world, and especially when it comes to the US program, refugees are going through all kinds of resettlement integration before they ever leave this transit country. And they might have been in that transit country for many, many years. This is exacerbated because there's so much, kind of US-oriented youth culture around the world. So if you want to understand integration, you shouldn't start today in Los Angeles. You have to go back sometimes years. And this is an image of somebody who's learning all kinds of things about the US and, typical American foods, pizza and so on. In this refugee camp out in the jungle in Thailand. So anyway, this is one of the many ways that we see this utility of thinking about what's happening in the so-called transit country. It also turns out that the transit country is absolutely critical for refugee resettlement. And this is almost always forgotten. And when you look at the kind of self-congratulatory discussions of refugee resettlement in a place like Canada, they might talk about how they're working with the partners, the UNHCR and the IOM. They might or might probably not mention the fact that the Americans are doing the security screening for the Canadians. And they'll talk about the refugees, but they don't talk about the host countries, the transit countries. But refugee settlement takes place around the world from just a handful of transit countries. And what happens in those transit countries is it enables places like the US and Canada and Australia to control the rate at which people arrive. One of the ways that you can see how that usually happens is to see a breach when it doesn't happen. So you may recall the scenes from, 4 years ago, when the Taliban took Kabul, the US very quickly withdrew, and its allies very quickly withdrew, much faster than expected, and there were these chaotic scenes at the airport of people desperate to get out, even sometimes trying to clutch onto the wheels of the aircraft taking off and falling to their death. I mean, really horrific, dramatic scenes. I think I have the picture coming in here, but not of the people falling to death, but of that situation. Okay, so that was really unusual to all of a sudden have tens of thousands of people from Afghanistan showing up at a military base in the US. because the normal resettlement mechanism didn't happen. It didn't have time to happen. But what's happening normally is that these transit countries are controlling the rate, and that makes resettlement much more politically palatable in the countries of resettlement. Publics, as we've just seen in the US case in the last election, don't like perceptions of uncontrolled numbers of people coming across their borders. And this is one really important mechanism that usually falls out of view. Okay, so another mechanism that we get when we look at these interactions is one that we briefly mentioned, the idea of remote control. And in this book, Refugee on Reach, I talk about the many different ways that the US and Canada, the members of the EU, Australia, have used remote control techniques. It didn't start yesterday. It goes back to the 1930s. But suffice it to say, for our purposes now, these are all the different ways that these powerful countries try to use potential transit countries to keep those asylum seekers from ever reaching their borders. There are many different techniques. Some of them are obvious. Some of them are kind of spectacles that you might see on TV. This is an example of a caravan. They use that word caravan of mostly Central American migrants trying to cross the border from Guatemala into Mexico, and the Mexican police pushing them back. Most of the way that this works is not so dramatic. It's mostly happening through the visa system. And we take it for granted that people need visas to travel. That's only since World War I that you've had an international visa system. And if you look at the countries with powerful passports that don't need visas to travel, and then you look at and so that's the Americans and the Swiss and the Emiratis and the Japanese and the Germans of the world, minor variations. You can get into most countries without a visa in advance. If you look at the countries on the bottom of that list, they're, say the bottom 10, the least powerful passports, they're all countries with a lot of asylum seekers. So if you have a passport from Afghanistan, South Sudan, Iraq, good luck getting someplace without a visa. So this is no secret to people with those passports. If you have a powerful passport, you can take that for granted. But so there is truly a global system, and it's so global to the extent that, for example, if I fly from Abu Dhabi in the UAE to the US, extremely far. We fly to Los Angeles, you're almost flying over the North Pole. You're passing US customs and US migration control in Abu Dhabi, talking to US agents wearing US uniforms who are deciding whether or not I'm admitted into the US, stamping the passport in Abu Dhabi. I mean, it's truly a global system, literally designed to keep asylum seekers at arm's length. Okay, so in this text, we talk about refugees at all times and places. We look at all these different cases, including a lot of cases that are not really recalled much these days. This is an image of refugees from the Revolutionary War in Mexico in the 19-teens after a lost battle, and they're crossing into Texas. At the time, they were called refugees, and there was a military camp set up on the U.S. border with the Red Cross and U.S. soldiers trying to figure out whether or not people were refugees. It's completely fallen out of even refugee histories today, even though they were called refugees in English. So we start several hundred years ago, but then we also come up to the present and talk about the way, for example, people do use new technologies to figure out, in real time where to go. I've always been skeptical of the effects of technology on all things migration. This is one where I've been completely convinced that it's more than connectivity with your place of origin. It's deciding where to go next is very much influenced by the technology. The technology has become a quasi-independent driver of these things. So, just to kind of sum up where we are so far, what we get with the systems approach is we're going to bring together insights from studies of conflict. Why is there violence? What are governments and other kinds of actors trying to accomplish with their violence? So we get out of conflict studies, the specific experience of refugees and IDPs and so forth with forced displacement studies, and then what we know from international migration studies about the importance of social networks and technology and the migration industry that channels people, even if they don't have access to social networks, and the way that the world system works. The way that, the best example of this is a phrase often used in the UK this is not refugee specific, by migrants who say, we are here, we immigrants are here in the UK because you were there. We are here, we Indians are here in Britain because Britain was in India. We are here because you were there. It's extremely pithy. I wish social scientists could write like this. It comes from a Sri Lankan novelist, actually, but that best captures the idea of a world system. Okay, so what happens if we try to think, though, about all of these different experiences together and still make it sensible? You can always keep adding more things to think about, and it becomes so messy that in the end, you can be left with the kitchen sink, and you understand less than if you were more careful. So, we do try to impose some order on this messy world. And so I'm going to show you here this chessboard, a mobility or an immobility chessboard, and I've got a couple of different axes here. So on the bottom here, it's, I'm hoping these are going to show up on this. Yes, phew. Okay, so you never know with different versions of PowerPoint. Sometimes these labels fall off. Okay, so on the bottom here, this is how much movement there is. And on this axis, that's how much coercion there is, like close in time, coercion right now. Degree of coercion from some outside actor, like I got to say. Okay, so in blue, we're looking at domestic cases, people who stay within their country of origin. And then in the green, these are people who have moved across an international border. And then in orange, these are people who cross the border and then they return back to their country of origin. Okay, so I'm not going to go exhaustively through all of these, but just to give you an idea. So people who stay where they're from and they're not facing coercion, call them voluntary non-migrants. They're not migrants and they don't want to leave. This is most of the world's population is in this category. And then you can think about internal migrants. So no one made them leave, but like me, I went to university in Texas and then I moved to California because I had a job. So voluntary internal migrant. And international scene, we can think about authorized immigrants. And then unauthorized immigrants, irregular migrants. The term is people use very across country, but we're dealing with the same idea. They're facing a little more coercion. Back over here on the domestic side. Say you stay where you are, and you stay where you are not because you're being, you stay where you are because you can't leave. And it's not because you're an intern, for example. It's because, say, you're a refugee, to use the term for, Soviet Jews who wanted to leave the Soviet Union and migrate to a place like the U.S. or Israel, and often just by the fact of identifying themselves, then became susceptible to more persecution. But that term can be used more generally. I already mentioned the idea of people who are besieged, they're targeted. So now the people under a lot more persecution, right? Persecution and coercion are on a continuum here. And then importantly is the people who were killed and never left. This is important because they completely fall out of the notion of refugees or even migrants, right? They never left. They were never on the move because they're dead. Why is this important? Because the reason that people leave in the first place is often tied to violence and even genocidal violence. And the people who are moving are related to the people who are killed. So we want to think about how those things relate to each other and avoid kind of a survivor bias, if you will, of only looking at people who survive. In some cases, this is trivial. In some, this is kind of the big picture. Okay, then you have IDPs, right? So they've moved domestically with a little bit more coercion. Over here on the international side, you can have open camp refugees. By this, I mean people who are in a refugee camp, but they can come and go. Maybe you can leave to go shopping or maybe to work, depends on the situation. As opposed to refugees who are in closed camps, where they have to stay in the camp. And even in the same country, like even within Jordan, there's massive variation over camp and also over time, into whether or not people have to stay in the one camp, or whether or not they come and go and they just live there. So there's a lot of variation there. Then we can think about resettled refugees. So at some point they were coerced, but in this moment they're resettled or they're granted asylum. So in this moment they're not facing a lot of coercion. Over here we see people who faced high degree of coercion. They've been refouled, or they've been deported. Maybe they're not refugees, but they're simply migrants who've been deported. So where whether you think they should or shouldn't have been. They faced a lot of coercion. Someone with the point of a gun forced them onto a plane or a truck. As opposed to people who are voluntary returnees, they just, I'm going to go home to the States on Saturday, I hope. Or pressured returnees are in between. And these days, this is the most controversial category. If the IOM is helping refugees return, there's always a question of how voluntary is that. In some cases, it's voluntary. In some cases, there are carrots and sticks involved. If you're going back to the very top here, people who never left the country, but they tried to leave and they were killed in transit. So this is the IOM's Missing Migrants Project. And there are many more that are never counted because they disappear at sea or in the desert. Or they might be killed crossing the border, people who are killed upon return. Over here is this is the prisoner internally relocated category. This is a huge number of people in some situations, like the Soviet Union under even Lenin, but especially under Stalin, where about 12 million people were forcibly relocated within the Soviet Union. So extreme degrees of coercion, and in many ways that seems like refugee migration, but they're still within the boundaries of the country. And then we can think about slaves who are transported against their will, very high levels of coercion, and less coercion and indentured servants. And then this is kind of a continuum here. So if you think about, like a kafala sponsorship system, or there's a lot of detail about the extent to which people are free to leave a particular system of contracted labor. Bottom line is, if you look at all of these things together, this is not all situations of mobility, but it gives a framework for understanding how different kinds of contexts, usually studied completely separately, relate to each other. So slavery studies don't think about refugees, and they don't think about regular international labor migration or people who just stay home. And this provides a way to try to think about these relationships, and also, as I'll show you in a minute, the fact that people move among those and households move among those. But to get to that point, I want to just briefly introduce you to this notion of the new economics of displacement. And this is very self-consciously drawing from the new economics of labor migration. New economics of labor migration is a perspective that's emphasizing the role of households and suggesting that when people migrate, they don't just decide individually, I want to move to another place. They're doing that as members of household economic units and household decision-making units. That's not to say that power is equal within the household. There are lots of studies showing the way that power is unequal by gender and by age, for example. Nevertheless, these are often not, they could be, but often they're not individual decisions, and the kinds of decisions that people are making are based on managing different kinds of risks. So the new economics of labor migration is it's all about managing economic risk. So managing the risk of an economic downturn leading to unemployment, or of a drought that wipes out the farmer's crops, or lack of access to credit, or the interest rates going sky high, and then de facto you don't have access to credit. So the idea there is that what people do is they'll say, okay, the son will go to this country, and the parents are going to stay at home, and then the daughter is going to migrate internally into the city, and so forth. And then the family has this kind of portfolio of economic activities. So, we take that idea and then we add on to that. We don't want to replace that. That's full of important insights. But we want to add on to that how people deal with physical risks. Risks to their physical integrity, risks of violence, as well as risks of persecution. And one of the important things about the new economics of displacement, and probably that we actually neglect to mention enough in the book, is that the role of relative deprivation is really important here in driving these dynamics. So it's rarely possible to look at a situation and say it's objectively so bad that this is why someone's going to move. That people are so poor that this is why they're going to move. Or that the violence they face is so high that this is why they're going to move. How we judge our deprivation is relative to some kind of reference group, and historically it's been some kind of proximate group where you can imagine yourself in that person's shoes. So, for example, if I'm, I don't know, if I see a Porsche drive by. I'm not jealous because I'm a professor at a state university. I don't have enough money to buy. I don't care about cars, but if I did, that's not what I would want to do with my money. Buy a fancy Porsche, and it's irrelevant to me. If I see some rich guy driving it, like, well, is he, he's probably an investment bank or something. Whereas if I'm in the faculty parking lot and I see the guy who's actually publishing fewer articles than me and he's driving around in a Porsche, then maybe I'm jealous because I can imagine myself in those situations. So this is a big part of what drives international labor migration. But the issue here for displacement is that the sense of deprivation, I think, is expanded through easy access to media and social media. And so people's reference group is now much larger than it probably was 100 years ago when someone in a village in Italy was deciding whether or not to Federal America. So that's another way that I think technology actually probably really is influencing people's decisions about whether to go or to keep migrating, is because their reference group, the sense of relative deprivation and also the sense of relative possibility is shifting. Okay, so thinking about this household model in chapter 4, we apply this to one particular family. This is a pseudonym, Aswur, which means bird in Arabic. How are you on time, by the way? Great. And so, these are real people, just with pseudonyms. So the key informant, if you will, in an anthropological sense, is Wajih. And half of the family is in Syria, as of the time of this writing, and the other half is in either Jordan or Canada. And so you've got, and the circles are women and the squares are men. Okay, so you've got the dad who's still in Syria, and he was stuck in a while in an ISIS-controlled area, and he stayed in any event to take care of the family affairs. He thought that if they just left, then the whole economic well-being in the long run would collapse. With a couple of daughters who were married to their husbands there, another son who's married, and then one of his daughters died. That's the slash means that she died. Okay, but his wife and two of the daughters went to Jordan. Now, why those two? Well, they were young, unmarried women. They were teenagers, and the family thought about this. There's not enough room in the car to have everybody get to Jordan, even though it's very close. They're from a town in southern Syria called Dira, where the revolution started, or the civil war started, whatever you want to call it. And they were just trying to get to Jordan. So it's just a few kilometers away. There's not enough room for everybody, so they said, these are our most vulnerable people, or the two, maybe they'll have been raped by soldiers or fighters or something, so they went. But they didn't want to have just, 3 women traveling alone, so they said, okay, 2 of the young men will go with. And so they did. So they went, and then some of these folks thought, well, maybe we'll go later, not understanding that the border closed. Eventually the Jordanian government closed the border. People think that states in the global south don't have capacity to control the borders. Not so. They have all kinds of capacity, not in every case, but they often have a huge amount of capacity if they want to use it. And that's what happened in Jordan. They closed the border, said no more Syrians. You can talk about why, but that's what happened. So bottom line is these people are stuck. So these people, they're in a set of different circumstances, but some of them are IDPs, some of them are at home. Some of them have gone back and forth to many different residences. They were IDPs here, and then they moved over here, and they're back at home, and then they became an IDP somewhere else. Never would have shown up in statistics because they weren't in some kind of camp. But they were moving around with family members within the region that they were from. Okay, then the key informant, Wajih, goes to Canada. He gets a special resettlement scheme for university students. He goes to Canada, and then there's a big discussion. Once he becomes settled in Canada, can he bring in some family members? Well, you can't just, as a recent university graduate in Canada, all of a sudden say, okay, I'm going to bring in my 10 family members. That's impossible. So they had a family discussion. And they decided, okay, we can send one. We can send one. Is it going to be one of the brothers or one of the sisters? They had a big discussion for various reasons we're talking about in the book. One of the brothers went, and that happened since this was written. But he married another Syrian refugee from the same region, but they didn't know each other until they met in Canada. And now they have a kid who's Canadian. So, within the same family, you can see this really complex history where you've got people stuck at home, people who are IDPs, people who were in a refugee camp in Zapri, and some of them were in the refugee camp, and one of them was actually able to get a sponsor, a kafid, to get out of the camp, go work in Amman, in the capital, and then others in Canada who are now landed immigrants and who are officially no longer even refugees. And so, well, this is before the brother came, I was thinking, should I go to Canada? And then there are others. One of the brothers left in Syria was thinking about seeking asylum in Europe, and researching what would it take to get from Syria to Jordan to into North Africa, and then risk his life, or maybe try to go through Turkey. So he's researching these different options, like thinking about this possibility. So what you get with the mobility chessboard, and I'll end here, is you can see the same family, and a lot of them end up over the course of this 10-year period that we're talking about in different places as voluntary non-migrants. Now, Wajif in Canada, he's no longer a refugee; he's an authorized immigrant. You've got family in the open camp. Zapri is now an open camp; people can come and go. As I said, he's not only is he resettled, but his brother is there. Now he has a baby who's a Canadian citizen. Other family IDPs. His dad was living in this, no longer now, still stuck in Syria, but was living in an ISIS-controlled area, and really was stuck in an area that's very unhealthy to be. And then you have someone in one of the closed camps in Jordan, in the more securitized camp, thinking, maybe I should go somewhere else and try my luck, basically trying to get into this category with all of those very serious risks and costs that are involved. And then, one of the sisters killed at home, never made it out. So, to sum up, with the systems approach and thinking about all these things together, we see how a refugeehood, this kind of more subjective experience from below of being a refugee, interacts with what Peter Cottrell calls refugee-dom, which is this more macro level about the logic of states and other actors creating the refugee experience. That, if you're interested, we'll give you a free chapter 1, and I look forward to the comments and the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, maybe David, you can also stay there for the discussion.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. I had the chance also to read your chapter you shared with Roman and with us, and I found actually that your proposal to put a system approach at the core has several merits to bring to the fore often hidden dimensions of displacement. And I'll start with the main one. I'd say you actually bring to that attention the need to study together actually internal and international displacement. And it's very true that actually in the literature very little is done to look into different stages actually of displacement and this alternance of mobilities and immobilities. I found absolutely fascinating that you have captured the complexity of these movements, stays, returns, with this example of this family. Actually, you describe in a fascinating way this longitudinal ethnography of the Answer family and how decision is made actually at each stage and with regard to each member of the family and what risk and interest are put in balance at each step. So I think this resonates very much with what we are actually doing here in Neuchâtel, like the nccr on the move, looking to this nexus between mobility, immobility, and migration. I found particularly stimulating to think together all these kind of movements, and often actually what is we are observing also through the fieldwork some of us are conducting as well, is that often forced migrants are stopped in transit, pushed back. They continue their journeys in other ways, or they are temporarily returned in the origin country, but not in the same regions to further go, etc. So I think these articulations between mobility and immobilities could be actually one lens through which your proposal of the system approach could be implemented and operationalized. But I also found very interesting the fact that you are shifting the focus from family, from individuals to households or family groups rather. I would like to ask you, maybe for the discussion, to clarify a bit more how actually you are situating the new economics of displacement, as you called it, with regard to the system approach. It is a way to get into research, a way to operationalize research in order to get insights into the global system, or how are you actually considering this the new economics of displacement with regard to the system approach? Also, I'd like to ask you, why are you choosing to put focus on household and not family? I'm asking the question as a scholar who worked for years on transnational families, and actually I think migration and displacement is very much related to family ties, but which are not necessarily located within a household. And I think you talked a bit in your lecture about the importance of networks and the fact of having a family tie in another place in the same country, in another region, which is not subject of violence or conflict, or to have an international family tie in another destination country could play a very important role as well. So why household and not family in your the choice you have done? Another important thing, I think, and we saw it very greatly in the description of the trajectories of the family members in the case of Asper families, the importance of the temporal dynamics in the decision processes. There are different overlapping temporalities. You didn't have time to develop this here, but we saw that when we're reading the text, that actually the decision who is to leave is done also according to some important family events or turns. I remember that one son is turning 18, so there is the risk that he will be enrolled. So the decision is to send him further, etc. So temporalities related to family, I would say configuration, but also related to so different time dimensions actually. Sometimes it's acceleration, sometimes it's urgency, sometimes it's just waiting for a new opportunity, and more often it's about temporariness, uncertainty. Actually, so I would like to know how do you see the temporal dimensions within your framework, and also related to the family or household importance in this approach, the changes to the life course events. I have thought, for instance, to the concept of linked lives. We saw that actually something that happens to one member of family will influence the choice left for others as well. And this is also part of this story. And maybe one last point. Actually, a question that I had in mind when I started to read your chapter and when listening to you, I would like to maybe hear you how, by actually elaborating this system approach, do you see the structure agency dichotomy, which is very much present actually in forced migration studies? We very often see this polarization between victimization and criminalization of forced migrants. Actually, forced migrants are either presented as victims or studied or put in narratives as victims, or as rather individuals who have the capacity to go beyond rules and have the capacity to make their own choices, but then without respecting the actually restrictive regulations that are very hard for them. So yeah, so I will stop here because I think to let also some time for the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, thank you. I'm going to keep it short, but very interesting. So, what we do, I suggest, because it's a great talk. So it's supposed to end at 7:30, and feel free to leave at 7:30 when they request. And I suggest that we take another 10 minutes for the discussion for those who want to say. So we finish around 40:45. And do you think you could address those questions in about 5 minutes? And then
yes, and maybe even less. But these are really useful, and I mean that seriously. And I'm always thinking about maybe some kind of second edition. So I'm still reflecting on these things, permanent change. So you're absolutely right about the fact that family is more important than household. So my flippant answer as to why we say that in the book is that we're relying on these cold-hearted economists who came up with household economics. But really, and sometimes there are household dynamics that are important, that have to do with non-family members who are sharing the same space. But by far and away, it's these family dynamics. And maybe the family members left the same physical household years ago. So I really like your calling me out on that, because it's not that household is unimportant inherently, but family is much more important. On temporality, this is something that we didn't systematically elaborate. I mean, we had the examples, but let me just talk about 3 different ways that the life force matters. So one is what you hinted at, which is that when young boys come of age, let's say more or less 18, then they become conscriptable, either by, and maybe in some cases it's younger than that, but basically at some point they become conscriptable by the army or by other armed groups, and that puts them at particular risk. So the gendered quality of being at risk is not necessarily about women. Like boys face these really serious risks when they come of age, and in this case, that is why one of them left, because he came of age. This also has to do, though, with girls coming of age, and that's part of the example of the difference between the 2 young sisters who went to Jordan and then the 2 who stayed behind. It has everything to do with being of marriageable age and then being married. Something that we didn't talk about, and I've never thought of until now, is the importance of the life course and how it interacts with immigration law. So thinking about the Canadian case, the Canadians famously have a point system where they give certain numbers of points for certain kinds of characteristics. So you get lots of points for speaking English or French and for having a university education and so on. You get more points for being in practice in the middle of your life, being working age. Being very young or being very old, it makes it harder to get into Canada. So if you think about the way that point system would interact with family members of refugees, especially those who didn't come in as refugees, maybe they came in through some other mechanism, then systematically it's going to make it much more difficult for some kinds of people to reach that kind of status. That has everything to do with the life course. So basically the lucky ones are kind of in the middle of their lives, not too young, not too old. And then the way that interacts with, the temporality interacts with policy is that, sometimes governments have open borders, sometimes they're closed. But we can expect that over time, if there's been a large migration refugee flow, that there will be compassion fatigue. That's what we see over and over again. So all other things being equal, I would guess that you might not want to be the first one out because they don't have resources developed, but you don't want to be the last one out either. So I think that there's an important pattern that we can identify. In terms of the question about, so what is the relationship between new economics of labor migration and the system? I didn't explain that well, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to say something else about that. The new economics of labor migration is important because it shows this way that labor migration, refugee migration, and family reunification come together through a family situation. And then, I walked you through those various examples. But that's kind of the nexus between, these siloed studies of labor migrants or family reunification, refugees. You see all of those things coming together by understanding this household, but even more often, family level dynamic as it's interacting with government policies governing different kinds of mobility pathways. And then the last point that I'll pick out so we can get to the rest of the discussion is this issue of victims. And when we discuss who is a refugee, we discuss all of these pieces by advocates in particular, and sometimes written by refugees themselves, that says we are not victims. And we actually disagree with that. We disagree with the idea that refugees are only victims. But it's really hard to look at a legal definition or even a sociological definition of refugee without having some sense of victimhood baked into the concept. To have experienced persecution, to me that's kind of weak. People are victims of persecution, but it doesn't mean they're only victims. They can have all kinds of agency. They can do all kinds of heroic things. Just because you're a victim in one area of your life doesn't mean you're a victim in every area of your life. So for us, victims, yes, but not only victims.
And
the way we
agency
see
is the level of the family then.
Pardon me?
Agency is the level of the family.
Well, no, agency can also be at the level of the individual. But, if you hit me in the face right now, I'm a victim, but I'm not only a victim. Like maybe I'll hit you, or maybe I'll run away, or maybe I'll call the police. Maybe I could do all kinds of things that require agency. But in the moment, yes, I am a victim of a crime. I'm the victim of your violence.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. There's this one other. There we go. Thank you so much. I was wondering, I found it extremely insightful. I was wondering something about the name, the title of the book, and also what you explain as a refugee system. To what extent is that the refugee system or the migrant system, in a sense that when you were explaining also the table and different stages, I see a lot of experiences that also some migrants might go through also when describing how households think of this. And in a way, I think it's also because if we think of it today, the term refugee is a bit limited in a sense, like in the legal sense that we have. And also, what I was wondering to what extent you believe this could also be used in terms of migration that is not conceived by the international migration system as a refugee migration, and people moving force, because it's tricky sometimes to distinguish. And also, when we talk of externalization, as when you mention also the visa system, that is migration, and is already indeed this belongs to the migration system rather than. So I was wondering to what extent you see this working with other examples, and if you thought of it and then you got to a more limited part of the whole system. Thank you.
Would you like me to take questions one by one, or I take a group? Yeah. So I started out as a scholar of international migration. So my whole career has been about international migration, and I've worked centrally on refugees in the last 10 years. So my general orientation is coming of thinking of all of these issues of, social networks, again, in the migration industry and wage differentials, all these things which are pretty generic to international migration and especially secondary and tertiary movements. But in this book, we wanted to both show how refugees are similar to other kinds of migrants, but also show where they're different. And the biggest differences have to do with the logics of exit and the way that states react to them rather than what refugees do themselves. We're not the first to argue this, but I think it's usually true, not always true, it's usually true that secondary, tertiary movements of refugees look pretty much like other kinds of international migrations that might have a strong, economic and/or family component. We could talk about exceptions to that, but I think that's generally true.
Can you go back to your chessboard?
Yeah.
Because essentially, it's exhaustive in a way that we all fall into one of the categories. If anything, the residual category, the non-migrant.
Yeah. So where it's not exhaustive, and people have called us out on this, is where is the economy here, or where are environmental disasters, or many other factors. So there are certainly forms of human mobility, tourism, that don't fit on this, and this is where I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too. So focusing on refugee, i.e. focusing on the coercion that makes the refugee condition. So that's why that's that axis on the left. But there are lots of, as you can see, because I just went through it all, there are lots of people who've moved for economic reasons that are on here, but we haven't said anything new about the differences in different kinds of economic rationales, for example. So it doesn't actually explain the whole world, but we think that it does a lot of work for one table. And hopefully it enables us to see something we didn't really think about in terms of the relationships.
No, that has really major implications, I guess, in studying.
And we hope that this would invite the reader to kind of fill in where are some other examples and to what extent they fit in. Maybe they don't, but maybe there are people who fit in, kind of right here, like people who have these temporary statuses, like temporary protected status in the U.S. or the similar kinds of complementary protection in various European countries and so on. So you can, don't take these boxes too seriously. And like a chessboard also, I think what's useful is some people have more power than others. Not everybody likes this because I don't want to say human beings are pawns, but some people have more power than others, depending on, again, the passport, your age, your gender, how much money you have, education. So some people have more ability to move, just like in a chessboard, the queen moves all over the place and the pawns move just a little bit. Capacity, and you can move backwards, right? Your example of the interaction between IDPs and refugees. I mean, this is a big issue for refugee statistics. That's what one of my current books is on. Most refugees were IDPs for at least a while. I mean, most refugees didn't get on a plane in their country of origin and leave within an hour. They often traveled over land. Sometimes they were IDPs for a long time. They might have not returned to their place of origin, but returned to somewhere else within their country, but are displaced within the country. It's very, very, very messy. And so hopefully this gives us a way to think about how somebody might, move back and forth, among these different categories.
Yeah, thanks a lot for a very fascinating talk and for making us also think outside of the box, or rather outside of the silos, as you call them. And I find these ideas very compelling, also the systems approach, and I have, it's actually more of a comment. I do indeed think that focusing on the family and on the household, we gain indeed a lot of this, and I'm saying this as someone who's using mainly quantitative data and a lot of survey data, national, international, experimental, and it just struck me that we do not have data on households on migrants, actually. I mean, most of the panels, like household panels, are from economics, and they're like national, so it's national household panel or the German set, or but we don't have this in kind of migration or mobility research. So I was just wondering, I do think we, you convinced me we need that actually. Are you aware of any initiatives where, that is done?
Yeah, so this is a great example of why I think it's useful to draw on the insights of international migration studies, which have been going on for more than 100 years when we think about refugees. So you have studies like the Mexican Migration Project or the Latin American Migration Project that systematically ask people in places of origin and migrants, including former migrants, questions about where their family members are, and then more interesting questions about how did you get your first job? How did you get your first lodging? And then, one of the pull-down responses is people from the same hometown or family members and so forth. So so that's not, systematically asked across the world, but there are a lot of surveys for migration contexts that do ask about social networks in a way that's quantifiable.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but it's not getting really at the household, right? There are really these household panels where we have the individuals that are all close to the household as such.
Yeah. So
is there any equivalent in
the best one that I know of that does that is the Mexican Family Life Survey, which has all kinds of migration information about people who've gone to the U.S. It's a cleaner example because 98% of Mexican migrants go to just one country. It's much easier than most migration contexts where people move. There are also studies. The Chittagong Valley in Nepal, looking at both internal and external migration, and I think there are a bunch of questions there. It's cited in the book several places. That's been heavily mined. It's one of the rare places where you have longitudinal surveys in a context in which you see a lot of labor migration, internal displacement, and refugee migration, all from one place. And so that's another place. Pardon me?
Where is that?
I think it's Chittagong. I don't know the context well, but I think it's the Chittagong Valley in Nepal.
Anyone else?
Can I just ask a little question about technology? You said that technology is so important for refugees to decide where to go. That I thought it was more to social ties, like a household, for example. In the example you gave, they wanted to go. Some of them wanted to go to Canada.
Yeah, so the technology is often the mechanism for taking those social networks and turning them into a decision. And there's a huge literature in transnationalism studies claiming that modern telecommunications technologies are radically changing the nature of long-distance belonging, that it's so different to live in one country and maintain ties there than it was 100 years ago. And that's usually just an assertion without considering the ways that a simple letter that might take a month to get back home maintained all kinds of really strong ties historically. So that's where I'm skeptical about the people who really emphasize the separate causal role of technology in shaping these kinds of migration relationships. But I think when it comes to people making decisions about, which route do I take, and trying to get from Syria to various places in Europe or beyond in 2015. So maybe you have family already in Europe, but you're finding out their advice about where to go, through WhatsApp or Facebook or what have you. That's not the only source, but there's lots of evidence suggesting that when people are hearing information, even from government agencies or humanitarian agencies, they're then checking its credibility, whether rightly or wrongly, with family members whose information may have grown stale, by the way, right? And so this is important for international migration generally, but it's especially important in forced migration because people often don't have well-laid plans in advance to leave. In the context of a multi-year civil war, you might have time to think about it. But a lot of people, if they just pick up and leave, they haven't done all their research like you would get from a new economics of labor migration economist who was, acting as if people were sitting there with, reading the Wall Street Journal and calculating wage differential and the chances of unemployment and so on. That's not how it works in practice, especially in a situation of fleeing violence.
So if you'd like, we still have time for one questions. Or, because we like to, or we can leave it there. Anyone? Yes.
Can I ask just the last question then? Do you know if there is other nations aside of USA and Canada that used to seem like great like an integration camp? And I also do not understand if it's organized like the, for example, the people that want to migrate in USA, they go to a reintegration camp that is made from the USA or these absurd organizations that then you may maybe go to Switzerland.
So the IOM operates pre-integration programs all over the world. Because the absolute numbers of people historically that participated in the U.S. resettlement program, we're talking about being abusing power, but last year 100,000, that's more or less 150,000 people a year. So the U.S. has its own massive programs, but it's relying again on these transit states. So if we look at, say, Indo-Chinese coming to the U.S. in the 1970s and 80s, they were doing extensive, months-long pre-integration workshops and so forth in places like the Philippines and Thailand and Malaysia. So just the scale of the U.S. operation and the fact that the U.S. has such a massive state capacity abroad enables them to have more extensive pre-integration than 100 people going to Japan.
Well, you said something very interesting about integration as well. If you want to get away from the siloed approach, then you have to think of the first time the person was exposed to American culture, right? I mean, it pretty much starts years earlier watching videos on YouTube. That's the integration process starts there, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's extremely interesting. The only problem I see with the siloed approach is the fact that you need to learn a lot about a lot of subfields. I know that you've done it in a compelling way. People like FitzGerald have written a global history of refuge, and they're very much pushing for that agenda. But do you think it is by any means realistic? I mean, what to expect that people, especially junior scholars, would be able to engage with conflict studies, with development studies, with international migration, forced migration studies. So what do you think? Is it more like a bit like methodological nationalism? You need to be aware of it and then you move on. Or does it have genuine implications as to how, including junior scholars, could the kind of questions they may ask? Not because I find it really mind-blowing, that you have a relationship between the person who's still at home and the voluntary returnee. That's extremely fertile and stimulating. Then I'm just wondering whether it would not just create some kind of over-dispersion and lack of focus.
Yeah, no, that's a serious risk, and we've struggled with that. And we don't think that you need to write a history of the world every time you write something. So then, tactically, what do you do? How do you operationalize any of this? Because already the world is overwhelming. And this is not a theory. This is not a theory that X causes Y. This is, in many ways, what we're doing is we're asking people to ask the questions, to look for things that might not be obvious by putting these multiple silos together. So I don't know. If you were studying asylum policy in Switzerland, we were discussing this over lunch, maybe you'd want to think about how that could potentially relate to the history of labor migration to Switzerland, and including path-dependent things that happened a long, long time ago, right? We were talking about 1848 earlier. To at least ask the question. So that doesn't mean that every time you write about asylum policy in Switzerland, you need to go to the archives and spend 2 years reading dusty documents. But you ask the question. Maybe you talk to other experts from that area over coffee and see if there's something there that's worth pursuing, and then maybe there's not.
So it's more of a epistemological awareness. It's like methodological nationalism. It doesn't mean that necessarily you have to give up on it.
Yeah, sometimes you do studies of the nation state.
Fundamentally, you need to be aware of the drawbacks.
And then the acid test is, did you see something that you wouldn't otherwise have seen? If the concept is useful, you saw something you didn't think about before. And if the concept's not useful, you already knew that, and everything else was just a distraction. So,
Well, you certainly made us see a lot, I believe. So thank you very much for being there. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I didn't see your hand.
Yeah, a bit late in asking the question, but because you just mentioned labor, I just wanted to ask, I mean, of course we have international migration, we have refugees, but even within the status of refugees, you have all these different differentiations that are being used by states to calibrate access to the labor market, for example. Recognized refugees, subsidiary protection, pending asylum applicant, which can take, there's a temporality there that can take 2 to 3 years. I just wanted to ask how does the question of labor actually figure in your attempt to emphasize the commonalities between migrants and refugees? Because it would, in my perspective, it would seem like a unifying element, the demands of labor markets and how states actually toggle with those definitions to serve economic interests. So I just, maybe your words on that.
yeah, so quickly without getting into all the historical details, in many countries, certainly before 51, there was no distinction between refugee policy and immigration policy, and states deliberately wanted people that they thought would build their economies, and they didn't care why they left. They just wanted those people. Even in the beginning of the European asylum regime or refugee regime with the League of Nations arrangements, the ILO was responsible for sending refugees as workers to various French-speaking colonies as well as to Latin America. They conducted the first survey of refugees, so that was all through the ILO, and that's important that it was the ILO. After World War II, there were all of these refugee worker schemes to send refugees to work in the mines in Belgium and the UK and in France because of the massive loss of life of especially young men during the war. You see a lot of refugee resettlement that is trying to positively select on skills. The Canadians used to talk about skimming the cream off the camps after World War II, off the displaced person camps. And in an international competition of trying to get the doctors and engineers and the lawyers before the Americans got them. They were very explicit about that. So you can see a lot of government policies that have an economic logic, but then there are other things that are happening, and not in rare cases, that cannot be understood by economic logic. For example, if you look at refugee resettlement priority, it gives priority to people who have serious discapacities and needs for advanced health care. So setting aside morality, no government trying to increase the human capital of its society or just create more workers doing manual labor would prefer people in that condition. A lot of people who resettled to the U.S. Are coming with very low levels of education and pretty large families from the Congo, for example. So I'm not saying they're not economically productive. I'm saying that if you were to design a program to increase the GDP of the U.S. by bringing in foreigners, that would not be a component of it. It has another logic. So, we're interested in seeing where that labor market logic works, but also realizing that it doesn't work everywhere. And often there's a very political logic, or there's this kind of path dependency, refugee pipeline logic, or interest groups in the U.S. that might prefer, say, Christians. That's actually part of the explanation of the Congolese case. So we're interested in that, and that leads us to surprising findings, that sometimes refugees are purely seen as workers, and sometimes they're not at all seen as workers.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank especially those students who came, bachelor students, MA students. That's great to have you, and we hope you will keep coming. That's why we want to finish on time, so that we don't dissuade you from coming. And thank you. It was great.
Thank you for the great comments and questions.